Now back to our subject of today, which is divine liturgy. Last week we have discussed about the church in the times of the persecutions, and as the persecution at the end of the at the end of the 3rd century, beginning of the 4th century, we see a boy named Constantine who grows up in the court of one of the greatest enemies of Christians, was Diocletian, the emperor. And this boy named Constantine, he grows there and grows to love Christians because his mother Helen was Christian. You know, she found the Holy Cross. And at one point, when he grows up and he becomes pretended to the throne, he sees in a vision a sign on the sky, which was the Holy Cross, and a voice that said to him that in this sign you will conquer. So he puts the sign of the cross on all the banners, on all the shields of the soldiers, and he goes and fights and wins in the sign of the cross. And there is this beautiful sight when, as he enters, I was speaking with Presbytera the other day, as he enters into Rome that was the scene of all the persecutions of the gladiators and animals killing Christians in the Colosseum there, we see an army that enters, and every one of the soldiers bears on himself the sign of the cross. What a sign of hope for all the Christians that were seeing this beautiful conquering army bearing this sign of the conquest of Christ himself over the devil and over death. And of course, Constantine did not disappoint, and immediately in 3013 he puts out the Edict of Milan, in which he frees the Christian religion from any restrictions. He gives back properties, he allows them to build churches, to consecrate priests. Priests are allowed to be citizens, even to be part of the government. And it starts at this point a new era in the church, where the church becomes one with everything. The church becomes one with the entire life of the city. The city becomes the church, and the church is the city. Robert Taft, who is a researcher in the Byzantine Rite, and especially in the Divine Liturgy, he says that in the patristic period, the church, the entire life of the church was liturgical. He says there were no Christian schools or catechism classes, no popular missions or retreats as we have today, but there were daily assemblies for morning and evening prayers. On the Lord's Day, there was a vigil and Eucharistic synaxis, meaning a meeting, with lessons and homilies. And there was Lent, when the bishop prepared the community's candidates for Easter baptism with long catechetical homilies, such as have come down to us from contemporaries like John Chrysostom, Cyril of Alexandria, John of Jerusalem, and Theodore of Mopsuestia. Even the more mundane ministries were also part and parcel of the liturgical assembly. Offerings for the sick and the poor were brought there and given to the deacons, who saw to their distribution. It was there that catechumens were instructed, initiated, penitents reconciled, and wayward corrected. Our modern compartmentalization of life into dearly defined and mutually exclusive categories was absolutely foreign to the early church, whose life was liturgical in the sense that the community's every activity was liturgy, which was a public service for the body of Christ. So that was the kind of the vibe there, that in Constantinople, for instance, the whole polis, from the emperor to the last beggar, was participating in the life of the church. It was their life. This we heard a lot of times talking about the symphony between the government at that time and the church, because both of them, they were working together for the salvation of the entire nation and every of its individuals. There was no division of what they should do. It was all for the same purpose. Now, in those times, it increased a lot the participation in the life of the church and in the teachings of the church as well. St. Gregory of Nyssa speaks about that in one of his passages, in one of his writings, when she speaks about the Arian heresy, and he was saying, every place in the city is full of the likes of it, the alleys, the squares, the streets. If you ask someone about changing coins, he discourses about the generated Son and the ungenerated Father. If you ask the price of a loaf of bread, he replies that the Father is greater, the Son inferior. And if you inquire whether the bath is ready, the answer is the Son was created out of nothing. Of course, these are Arian teachings, but just to show how much people were talking about it, that they were not talking about football, baseball, the weather. They were talking about theological things. It was their main preoccupation. Therefore, the participation in the services was with full understanding and involvement. Before Divine Liturgy, so you can understand kind of how was the life, let's say, in the polis, in the Constantinople, which became the capital once Constantine was elected emperor. He elected himself emperor. Every morning on Sundays, there was a procession from the palace that was going through the city for hours. And everybody was there. No one was complaining because there was nothing else to do. The hippodrome was closed, everything was closed. Everybody was concentrating on church on Sundays. When they were reading the gospel, for instance, there is this account from one of the pilgrims there, her name is Egeria. He says, for instance, as they were reading the gospel of the accounts of the passions of Christ, she says, at the beginning of the reading of the gospel, the whole assembly groans and laments at all the Lord underwent for us. And the way they weep would move even the hardest heart to tear. And again she says, it is impressive to see the way all the people are moved by these readings and how they mourn. You could hardly believe how every single one of them weeps. Right? So this is how we should do it. Every time we see the gospel, we should enter into it. And they were entering like that. When the gospel was accounting about Christ being crucified, they were crucified with him. And after the reading of the gospel, everybody was participating. It came to the Holy Communion. And in Hagia Sophia, you had 5,000 to 10,000 people at once. So the communion, although they had many stations, and they were distributing many deacons and priests together, it would take from the third hour to the 6th hour. That means from 9 a.m. to about 12 p.m. 3 hours of just giving communion constantly, with antiphonal singing and everything. You can imagine how disorganized, but also how beautiful it was to see so many people coming together to the Divine Liturgy. So to summarize, during these times, there are a few things that affected the Divine Liturgy itself. First, because of this interest in theology, the true faith of the church entered into this synodal movement where everything was started to be laid out according to the tradition that was preserved by all in all places and at all times. And this theology was incorporated in the Divine Liturgy. The Creed entered into the Divine Liturgy, and many other prayers, they have a heavily dogmatic content. Second, they started a huge amount of construction and repurposing of buildings. The first basilicas, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia, they were built, and other replicas and smaller churches that became the model for any future Orthodox church, including ours, are starting from that era. The architecture started to basically serve the purpose of the liturgy. So there was a huge link between how the liturgy was done and how the churches were built. The cycle of services started to be developed first in Constantinople at the great church, and then were perfected in monasteries that were along the side of Jerusalem and Constantinople, like the monastery of the Studios, where Theodore the Studite and St. Savas, in Jerusalem, and others. They contributed to the services and the order that we have today. And we had hymnographers like St. Jamaskin, Romanos de Melodos, and others that started writing a huge body of hymns that we are using until nowadays in the church. Iconography, mosaics and paintings on wall or on mobile icons started to develop, so much that at one point there was a great clash, right? The iconoclasm, right? Holy relics of the saints were uncovered and churches were built upon them, and processions, with the recovery of those relics, and every time during the year with the Holy Cross that was found by Helen, they were all part of the life of the church. The vestments that we see today are borrowed from the way they were vesting in the emperor's houses and in the palaces, and we incorporated some of those in the vestments of the bishops and of the priests, which are representing the King of all, which is Christ himself. So obviously it will take a few centuries to get to the point where we are now, but all we know is that their purpose is the same purpose as we have today when we come to the Divine Liturgy, to show that the kingdom of heaven is here now. So the architecture, the icons, the music, the gold, the incense, everything is trying to bring in a physical form something that is spiritual, which is the kingdom of heaven. We're trying to leap in faith and in hymns to the place where we all are going to enter at one point with Christ. So that was all for today.